This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
The young shining cuckoo is fed by its foster parents on insects and spiders. But the korimako, or bellbird, has a much more interesting diet of nectar. It's been something of a radio personality and has sung on shortwave radio to Australia and the Pacific nations for 30 years. However, the early recordings failed to reflect the versatility of the bellbird, with its wide variety of liquid notes and artistically placed clicks and bell-like sounds. It's not surprising that Maori mythology describes korimako, the bellbird, as the messenger of Tane, sent to herald the coming of the sun.
Community or chaos? We can construct and nurture community or fall into chaos. Over the next hour, Marvin Hubbard hosts conversations toward creating a fairer, more equal society.
Community or Chaos is made possible with the support of Quakers Aotearoa. You'll find them online at quaker.org.nz.
Good morning, friends. Today we have Victor Billot, the Communications Officer for the Maritime Union of New Zealand, and also past and present leader of the Alliance. And we'll have to talk about what the Alliance is at some point. Anyway, welcome, Victor.
Hi. Thanks for having me, Marvin.
You can podcast this by going to oar.org.nz, then going to podcasting, looking for community or chaos. Victor, you identify yourself as a socialist. Could you explain what socialism is? Start from an easy question.
Right off into the deep end, right away. Well, I think that is it's a good question. I think the basic definition is of a socialist is someone who believes in socialism, which is technically the common ownership of means of production, distribution and exchange by the general population rather than private individuals. So what does that mean in practice? Look, I think there's all sorts of different ways of looking at it. We have people who are revolutionary socialists, we have people who like Chris Hipkins, who these days says he's happy to be called a socialist. I don't understand that at all. So you have people who have very different interpretations of it. I would just probably say in the New Zealand context, for me, as a democratic socialist, I believe in reform, but I'm a reformist in a hurry. So I think we need to have a much more equal society. I think there needs to be a lot more public or common ownership or community ownership of our assets. And with that would come a more democratic society, and one in which the majority of people who working class or in some cases beneficiaries would have a more control over their lives and a better standard of living. That's the goal. So lots of different. I think another thing to say about it is for me it's a process, not a destination. I think we're continually evolving as a society. We moved towards socialism in New Zealand and elsewhere around the world in the last century, and then in the last couple of generations we've moved away, and I think that's had some bad impacts on the majority of people. So, yeah, that's my definition of socialism.
When I arrived in New Zealand in 1972, that shows my old age, somebody interviewing you who's much older than you are. Norman Kirk was Prime Minister. I didn't see people sleeping in the streets. There was nil unemployment and very little homelessness. State housing was still flourishing, and the first home buyer had lots of assistance from the state. Nobody dreamed of needing food banks. Most families had only one car, but they also either owned their home or had secure, affordable housing. What the hell happened?
Well, that's a question that is on a lot of our minds at the moment. I think the first thing to say is you were quite right. And although in the 1960s and 70s there were a lot of things in New Zealand that weren't that great, one of the things that was progressing in the right direction was a level of economic security, and I would say that gave people real freedom as opposed to abstract freedom that you're free to become a billionaire, but you may end up in the streets, So I think there was a different type of freedom, a freedom that security brings. Now, my father immigrated roughly at the same time as you did, about a few years earlier in the late 60s, and his comments are often the same. In some ways it was a great place and to his way of thinking. He was just a working person, a printer. He come out from the UK, and he just remembered being able to, if you didn't like a job, you just left and you'd walk down the road and you'd just knock on a door and you'd find another one, literally. For working people, there's all sorts of advantages to a world like that. And that's obviously changed. And some of those changes, I think, are to do with things that have happened in the external world, which New Zealand and people don't necessarily have a lot of control over, and they would include things like globalisation, the return of neoliberal capitalism. And some of those things have been choices that have been made by New Zealand, or the people in charge of it, often in a dishonest way. They've been elected and they've done things that they said they wouldn't, or they didn't tell people about it, and they just did it when they got in because they knew best. And I think that's what we saw in the 80s and 90s. And so we're still dealing with the fallout of that now. But I think just to conclude that thought, I think that I was just talking about this with one of my fellow Alliance Party members this morning, and he made the observation that, like in the 80s and 90s, there was the excuse, well, New Zealand was broke, we had to change, this is what's happening. But now we've still got those same policies. They obviously haven't worked in terms of delivering for younger people, working people, people on lower or fixed incomes, the majority of the population, in other words. They haven't worked. And people are struggling, but no one's saying now, well, we had to do this. It's almost this embarrassed silence about where we've ended up. So what the hell did happen? That's a good question.
One of the things that I remember about Norman Kirk was that he ran a boiler. He was an engineer. He worked for the city council before he got into politics. And probably he was one of the last working men to be a prime minister in New Zealand. He was the last working person to be a prime minister and also have a lot of allies. Matt Rata, who helped bring back the significance of the treaty and land reform for Maori, was also a working person. And those, both unemployment, foreign policy that was morally responsible against nuclear weapons, and economic equality, they all went hand in hand. None of these other projects were an excuse for ignoring economic inequality, which seems to have happened with the parties of the left since then. 2 years ago, Inland Revenue had a research which they're now not able to do because the government's made sure they plugged that hole, which showed that the wealthiest New Zealanders pay less than half the tax rates of other Kiwis and much less than their peers in similar OECD countries. Isn't this crisis caused by neoliberal economic policies where our governments have been unwilling to go into debt to pay for physical infrastructure, unwilling to introduce more equitable taxes, such as strong capital gains, corporate income taxes, various forms of wealth taxes, and haven't our public services, particularly health and education, suffered? All our infrastructure has suffered.
Yeah, well, I think that's there's a little bit to unpack there, but I think that obviously the relationship of tax to public services and infrastructure is an important one. And I think we're seeing that at all levels at the moment, both on the national level and the local level. What's happened is in a sense, the goal of the right-wing economic shift in the 1980s and 1990s has been a success in the terms of the people who introduced it. Now, we could discuss about neoliberal economics and the type of economics that was before that, which was mainstream, which was Keynesian-style economics in New Zealand with a mixed economy that had elements of – it was a capitalist economy, but it had heavily regulated elements, which made a big difference. So,
well, Keynes actually wanted to regulate the economy in support of the common person.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, Keynes certainly wasn't a socialist, but he did see that he felt that, in my understanding, he felt that unregulated capitalism was not going to be a successful system, and in the long term, he saw it fading away. I guess what happened though is those Keynesian economic policies, as they were called, which were introduced in the 1930s in New Zealand and basically carried on right into the 1980s, they had they were a practical response to problems, but they also, I would argue, did benefit the common working person. But I think what happened, of course, is what changed is that the interests of the people who own our society, whether they're overseas investors, corporates or shareholders, whether they're owners, landlords of commercial landlords, whether they're large-scale business owners, people just with a lot of money, capital, it was in their interest to change the way the economy worked. And they've ended up becoming a lot wealthier. And the majority of the population, in some cases, have held their ground but increasingly struggling. And in a lot of cases, are objectively worse off, and our society is objectively worse off because of the effect of the changes in taxation, and that has affected the changes in the distribution of wealth in society. Certainly, it's obvious that unless there's a strong redistribution of wealth in a capitalist economy, you end up actually getting an oligopoly. You get an aristocracy
it keeps getting
of capital.
more it doesn't. People, used to say, "Well, we'll have an equilibrium, and it's cyclical, and wealth and capitalism will be happy." But the trouble is, the greed of capitalism has no limits.
Well,
no
I think
environmental limits, no ethical limits.
It's a system that it even almost in a strange sense gets into this abstract level where it's beyond the obviously individual greed is a driving factor, but it has a logic of its own. And a capitalist has to keep on operating as a capitalist, otherwise they'll lose their money. So it just it kind of is a self. The system is really running itself. It's really running the people rather than the other way around.
But you can point it in different directions, as Keynes did.
Yes, you can. The question there, of course, is a tough question, though, because, of course, there are a lot of arguments and with some basis that the type of economy New Zealand had in the 1960s and 70s, when we had guaranteed markets in Europe, when we had when the world was not globalised, it was a completely different international order. That's not here now. So it would be hard to get back to where we were because of things like we're so locked into the international economic order now. But unless you give it a try, we're going to continue with the problems we have around the distribution of wealth and all those the other problems that go with that, which spring out of that really, and that includes things like healthcare, education, housing, etc.
And the dissolution of the environment.
Well, and that's the that's what you call the elephant in the corner of the room, which no one wants to talk about, is unless there is a change of direction, then I think that human civilization as we know it, perhaps not the human species, but human civilization as we know it, is going to look radically different by the end of the century, or even sooner, once the key issue, of course, is global climate change, and that is driven by economic systems. And if anything, I think there's less effort being put into fixing that now than there was maybe 10 or 20 years ago.
One thing, I make a claim that before the 70s, or during the 60s and early 70s, there was an international system, but it was a Keynesian international system. And the global system that we have now was totally based on the financial market. In fact, the way we made money worldwide changed. Making wealth in the 60s was because you made things. You made cars, you made trains, whatever. But sometime in the 70s, it became a system was based on a casino effect, on the financial economy. The finances took control, and they also were among those who pushed neoliberalism.
Well, yes, that's true. I think it was part of that whole process that kind of had its roots probably in the 60s and 70s, and then obviously it came to fruition in the 80s and 90s, which was the process of globalisation. And with that, you had other related things, which you like say the financialisation of the economy, the collapse of manufacturing in the West, the shift of manufacturing to offshoring to Asia in a lot of cases. And, of course, another thing was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think that maybe had an impact too, because in the 50s and 60s, the early part of the century, communism had a large appeal because capitalism was working so poorly. And so in order to save capitalism, changes were made to make it more palatable to the working class majority. And you could say that was a bit of a cynical move, because as soon as the competition from the Soviet Union ended, seems interesting that the kind of protections and welfare
the end of
state
history
disappeared. Well, all those things, those protections for the working class disappeared. Of course, there's the case of China, which is a unusual one that I don't really think anyone's got their head around. But I suspect maybe for the rest of the century we may see a battle between a kind of the obviously decaying Western American neoliberal model and more dynamic authoritarian type of state capitalism that you see in China. But it's obviously got problems as well.
Are you confident that the Labour Party will introduce the transformative tax and other economic structural policies that will transform capitalism in New Zealand?
Well, I think the answer to that was really has been given by Chris Hipkins, and his answer was no. His answer was that they were going to introduce a highly limited capital gains tax that would pay for a few free doctor's visits. Now, no one's opposed to a few free doctor's visits. A good idea, but that's not transformative. I mean, it's not even holding the line. I mean, the reality is it's about more than a few free doctor's visits. It's about it should be about changing the whole distribution of wealth in New Zealand, so that basically it takes the burden of the working class majority, who you would assume the Labour Party would be concerned with. I don't know. I don't think there's that. They probably think that you can't do it or something, because if you try to do anything, then the people who own New Zealand will say, well, you're not doing that, we're just going to stop you. So maybe it's that's fear of that. Maybe they don't really have the ambition. But nothing they do is transformative. The only transformative thing they've done in the last 20 years is they've had some transformative rhetoric. I think that's basically in the economic sphere. I mean, there's other things that have been going on, but I'm just talking purely about
and actually
economics.
Had a minister of Inland Revenue did want to bring in transformative taxes and hit Christians not while I'm Prime Minister. It was David Parker.
Well, I think the other thing is that, that would have been interesting to see how that would have panned out.
They might have won the election if they'd have been discussing that instead of we're better managers of capitalism than you are.
Well, I think how they... unfortunately, I think a lot of it comes down to their primary goal is winning elections. So, I mean, and which is a understandable goal if you're a political party. You've got to win elections to have your introduce your program of change. But the trouble is that they feel the way of doing that is by appealing to this ever-shifting, quite amorphous middle ground, I think, of swinging voters. So what it means is they don't try to change the way people think. They don't advance ideas. They go to where people are currently at and say, well, we're going to divvy up the votes based on this unchanging kind of worldview where people just think the same things and quite conservative. And whereas change has happened in our society, obviously, you just have to look at the first Labor government. They took power in the midst of the Great Depression. And so they had to come up with new ideas. They were compelled to. And they also, I genuinely think, actually wanted to change society. I don't think. I mean, really, I just, all I've been seeing in the last few days in the front page of the news websites and so forth is Chris Hipkins has got engaged, which is, congratulations. But I just don't think this is not important news for New Zealand. We want to see what the opposition are offering in a crisis, and we're being fed this kind of like woman, I don't know, this it's kind of like this popular culture kind of stuff about his personal life, which is really of no interest to anyone with a brain, let's face it. So very strange, and he obviously plays along with that because that's what you have to do to win elections these days. So it's quite sad, really.
I take it you don't recommend that we just rejoin the Labour Party and try to transform it from within?
Look, I think I don't know at the end what is the best approach to these things. Some people obviously think that joining the Labour Party, they can affect change, and I see there's quite a few, there's good people I see in the Labour Party and trying to affect change. They've got some good candidates and things. I don't think that's it. I don't think it can be changed. I think it has become so compromised, it's part of, and it's dominated by status quo thinking. So it doesn't matter how well-intentioned or even how radical people they are. I just think the institution is exhausted. Now, in terms of being an opposition, it might be quite successful because it's like in the sense of getting back in government, because obviously the Hipkins theory is that you just don't say anything or you soft pedal it and eventually the government gets so unpopular and you go back in because everyone's sick of Christopher Luxon and they want to change. So that may well work, but what's the point if you're not going to do anything or you're just going to tweak things? What's the point, really?
Do you think the Labour Party's ever owned up to what they did in the mid-'80s under Longy and Roger Douglas? I mean, I heard Longy in a speech say that the driver of the economy is inequality, to quote him exactly. That wasn't Roger Douglas, that was David Longy.
Well, I think the problem with a lot of those people is that they kind of they don't like talking about it, obviously. That's they were different people. That wasn't the Labour Party that did that. That was some people who temporarily took it over. The trouble is, though, is that they have the people who then, in the modern-day Labour Party, has never bothered to actually really walk back a lot of those changes.
They have the same roots, don't they?
Well, I think definitely they never returned to being what they were. Obviously, Rogernomics is out, and the Labour Party now has you could say, is tacked a bit to the centre, but the centre has moved so far to the right that it's kind of meaningless. So I think, to be honest, the only person from that era who, I'm not really giving him any credit for it, but he did it, who said that the policies of the 80s and 90s were to some degree, an error was Jim Bolger, who was in the National Party, of course, the Prime Minister. I've never heard anything really as blunt as that from someone like Helen Clark or Jacinda Ardern. No matter how kind she is, she just doesn't mention it. Maybe that's not about kindness, it's some other thing we don't talk about.
Could you briefly talk about the Alliance, its past and its current status and purposes as an organization? I know that's difficult because it's in metamorphosis.
Sure. Well, I'll keep it very short because it's a big bit of history there, and it's a good question because really, we can criticise the Labor Party as much as we like for not doing enough, or some people say they're doing too much, but at the end of the day, you've got to give another cliche, you've got to actually advance what you think. So the Alliance Party was obviously a major player about 2 or 3 decades ago in New Zealand politics. It was in government at one point, in coalition with Labor. It achieved, I think, quite a lot in its time, but for various reasons it fell over. And basically for the last 10 or 20 years it's effectively been, it never went away, but it hasn't been running in elections, and it was basically dormant. It was on ice. In the last year, a group of a new generation, I guess you could say, have come forward who feel the need for a democratic socialist political alternative in New Zealand. They've identified the Alliance as being a potential vehicle for that, and they have we've had a boost in membership and structure. And recently we had our first candidate for a long time who ran unsuccessfully, but he ran a good campaign in the Christchurch council elections recently, Tom Roud. So the Alliance is back in action. Small, obviously, but I certainly think that, I've been involved with it a long time, and I think that very different from 20 or 25 years ago when we were struggling to get any interest. I think there was a new dynamism, a new energy, and I think it's coming from the fact that a lot of the people coming into the party now, all this stuff happened. It's history to them. We're getting people in their 30s, their 20s and 30s, and they've got a completely different experience. So they see what's happening overseas, and they feel that the Alliance could have this kind of role in New Zealand.
Well, I'm going to play some music, and then we'll come back. That was Bruce Springsteen. Played it because I like Bruce Springsteen.
There's no other reason required. I like that.
We're talking to Victor Billot about the socialism and about the Alliance and where we go from here. Now, some people might say that the very name Alliance is retrograde, that it takes you back for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, well, at the moment, we now that we are kind of reformatting, we're having to go through a lot of stuff. For example, updating our policies. The principles are very much the same as they used to be, but the policies, obviously, time moves on. So we need to update those and make them relevant to 2025, 2026. The branding, which is what we call it these days, it's a good question. And there's a variety of thoughts about whether we need to go with a new name. At the moment, I think what we are going to do is have a process where we have a discussion on that, and we will probably make a decision which will involve obviously the members of the party to whether we continue with that brand, that name, or find something else.
Do we really want a brand, actually? Don't we want a name? Don't the Alliance people want a name that says where they're going and says what they're about?
Well, I think that's what a brand is. But the trouble is, of course, it's it's usually used in the context of a capitalist consumerism, but that's effectively what it is. It's just something that inspires people and gives a sense of what the organisation is.
It has to inspire its members first, doesn't it?
Yeah. Look, my feeling is that I'm neutral on it, to be honest. I don't think it's something that is going to be the make or break of the alliance, the name, whether it's something that or something else. I don't think that is. If the membership want to change, I'll go with that. And if the membership don't want to change, I'll go with that too, because my feeling with it is the name is what you make it. The bonus with the name is it does, for some people, you could say, well, it's looking back into the past. But, of course, we have names in New Zealand politics of parties that go back to the 100 years or more, like the Labour Party, or the National Party is nearly 100 years old now. And what does that mean? What does national mean? It means very little. The Labour Party means very little now too, because it doesn't obviously just represent labouring people. It basically represents I don't know who it represents, public sector managers, I don't know, lawyers, who knows. But it's like the name is really what you make it. So, but I think there are, around that is also slogans and messages, and they have to capture something. So there have been some other suggestions. We could use a name around the thought of the common good, which is I think is a good kind of has a ring to it. Some people think we should use the term socialist, which I don't have a problem with either. But once again, that is something some people say, well, in the New Zealand context, it's kind of quite. It's not like other countries would have got a more sophisticated understanding of politics. And in New Zealand, you say that, and there's been so much right-wing propaganda over the last 50 years that people get, upset about that term. So even though basically that's what we are. So, interesting debate to be had.
How would you differentiate the economic policies that you support and the Green Party's economic policies?
Well, I think the first thing it's important to say is I don't really feel that my goal is not to the goal of the alliance is not really there to take out the Green Party or steal their votes, because of all the parties out there, that's obviously the one that's in many areas is closest to us. However, I think it's a matter of focus. I think they have some good their taxation ideas, for example, I think are moving in the right direction. But I feel that it's a matter of focus, and I think my feeling is that the Green Party, especially with its kind of its hip urban kind of wing, are very much, it's representing a certain demographic, and I don't think that they are being successful in growing beyond that. They're being a very successful niche party, but I think the problem is that they are so locked into identity politics, and I don't believe they have a strong orientation towards the working class, which is a bit of an old-fashioned term, which some people don't like. But I'm old-fashioned and I do like it. And I think that that is where the alliance differs. We would very much focus on economic issues that affect working people or beneficiaries. And our goal is to advance their class interests, if you want to put it in that terms. Whereas with the Greens, it's a little bit more confused, I think, and their focus is on a lot of things. Having said that, I don't think that the alliance wants to be trying to cannibalise Green votes. That's not the point. We're focused on trying to build support amongst the hundreds of thousands of people in New Zealand who just don't vote, who aren't interested. And, everyone's concerned about divvying up, and the Labour Party's like this too. They're all concerned, going to split the vote. It's like, well, how about instead of worrying about splitting the existing vote, how about you take some effort to actually and responsibility for that growing number of New Zealanders who are so disconnected and alienated from the system that you have created, that you try to get them involved, and you might find you have a new audience then. Well, maybe that's too much hard work. I don't know.
Well, the concern about certain things is certainly ramped up. The concern about homelessness and the fact that the younger generation, it isn't just people that are sleeping in the streets, but generally the younger generation is going to have real problems ever owning a home. And yet we don't have secure state houses.
Well, it's obvious. I mean, this is the thing. It's an interesting thing, though, is that we all know what the problem is, yet no one can seem to either articulate or certainly not advance a successful alternative. I mean, that is the problem, and I wonder, I often think about this, I wonder if it's something to do with the fact that the left wing has become kind of disconnected from wider society. It's largely become a kind of, it's disappeared into a kind of an academic maybe world where it's there's thousands of articles, books, papers, everyone knows what the issues are, yet there is no consistent, powerful movement that is bringing together the concerns of the majority of people around these things. So I think that is a problem. I mean, I just always think of the quote by Alexei Sayle, the British comedian, who said that people ask the question, say that art can't affect politics. Your art won't influence politics. But he says, then again, politics doesn't influence politics anymore. I mean, there's a lot of people who disagree with where society is going. But the problem we have is there doesn't seem to be any institution or organisation that can advance the alternative that people want. And I guess that's why my effort is in the political realm is going into something like the Alliance, because I think it has a very clear message, a non-compromised message that we need to head in a completely different direction to which the way the society is going at the moment.
When I hear the idea that we can't afford hospitals, we can't afford if we can't afford a hospital, how come we can have more and more private hospitals, for instance?
Well, I think there's a kind of a process going on here where we've privatised a lot. New Zealand's a very different society. The public services have run down a lot, obviously, but there's all sorts of factors at play. Like people are living longer for hospitals, they need more medical care. People are living longer lives as a result, so they need more medical care, things like that. So there's no doubt that there's more demands on the system. But the question is that is used to say, oh, well, we can't have a public health system anymore. But what I say is that, well, it's not like New Zealand's been sitting still for the last 100 years. We've never been invaded in the last 100 years or anything. It's a country that has, a relatively stable history. It's got natural resources, it's got an educated population. So why can't we organise things so we can have those things? It's a question. There is pressure on the system because of changes, but it's also because I believe that capital, money, business is looking for constantly on the lookout for things that it can buy up and make a profit out of. And the health system is one of those things.
It's really worked well for electricity, hasn't it? Particularly users in the wintertime. Well,
it's like a lot of these things is that it's worked well for the people who own electricity companies, but it's a bit screwed up in New Zealand because, of course, some of the owners of the electricity companies are actually the government, which makes it even more stupid. But, it is about there's winners and losers in these things.
But the thing is about power generation now is that it isn't based on producing cheaper, more efficient, non-carbon electricity. It's about the dividend, a dividend for the owners of the generation plants, but also for the government, who also owns dividends. If they get dividends, they don't need to worry so much about raising taxes and irritating the business community.
Well, this is the interest, and I think that's where there's probably a little bit of a kind of cognitive dissonance going on with the National and Labour parties because, especially in the National case, they actually support selling off these things. But they also are obliged, as any government does, to actually pay for things that people want. So they do have an interest in hanging on to a profitable state-owned enterprise. And it's the same with Labor. I don't think they want to rock the boat. I mean, there's a lot of anger about electricity. Everyone knows the system's dysfunctional. Just like the supermarket duopoly and so forth. Everyone knows it's wrong. Even the National Party says we're going to do something about it, but they don't do anything about it. But they talk about it because and then people just go on with their lives, and you have to go to the supermarket to buy your stuff. So you just go and do it and grumble about it, and life goes on, and the supermarket owners do very well, and everyone's that's how it's life in 2025.
People end up going to the food banks because they can't afford to buy food.
And that's and the people who are working class people are asked to subsidise the worse off working class people. Where workers are asked, put a bit of extra food in for your starving community members. No one ever says, well, why do we have starving community members? That would be we just rely on the charity thing, and that's a feel good. But you don't, and it's necessary. I mean,
it takes you back to the late 18th century and early 19th.
Well,
century.
I loathe charity, but I also, at the same time, I realise it's probably it's a bit of an abstract thing to loathe it, because I mean, people out there are dependent on food banks at the moment. They're dependent on charity. But it's a terrible thing that we've got into a position where charity has become a necessity rather than a kind of a little fundraising for a little bit of extra things. It's become what's stopping people from starving. So that's a very strange position to be in a country like New Zealand, to have food banks to stop people from going without food. That's very unusual. Very
when
strange.
You're told we can't afford a welfare state, what do you think about a country like Finland? Finland's got lakes and trees. They don't have any more resource. They don't have oil. They don't have a big fishing industry. But they have a welfare state that's working, and their economy is working well. So what's the difference? Are they smarter than we are? Are they?
I think possibly. No, I think I think part of the problem is that for the last 40 or 50 years, New Zealand's adopted an economic model that hasn't been successful in a lot of ways. It's been successful in some ways, but it hasn't been overall a success. I think that a country like Finland probably has some advantages. I mean, it's close
to the market.
It is close to a very large European market, even though it's not. I don't even know if it's part. It's also got a next door to Russia, which is an interesting situation. But it certainly, they focused on, and it hasn't. This hasn't been a complete success story, but they focused on like certain big enterprises like Nokia, the phone company, and that was that was kind of like their Fonterra. But it's interesting that they focused on technology, So I think that New Zealand would find it a little bit harder to be like Finland, but it still would be a better model, I think, going down that path of having a more regulated, more planned type of capitalism. I would prefer that. It wouldn't go far enough for me personally, but I think it would be better. It would be a better direction to get on, and then you could build on that. Some people would disagree. But, yeah, I think that a lot of it, there are very hard constraints out there at the moment. No one says there isn't. But I think that, the potential is there. This is going to be a big debate in the alliance. Like, for example, there's questions about things like the New Zealand's natural resources, oil and gas and mining and so forth. I mean, what role should they play, if or any, because there's a very polarised debate going on out there in the world at the moment about that. Then there's questions like the role of automation, which is no doubt going to improve productivity, but if it puts people out of work, then, well, what happens then? So it is quite an interesting, exciting time, but at the same time also a very dangerous and
one of the exciting
time.
things is the environment. The world's environment is plummeting.
Yes.
And I would suggest that capitalism is facing two big crises. The normal crisis that capitalism always faces of the profitability running out and the idea of a crash every 40 years or so, or less, or more often. But also the idea is that capitalism is based on material growth. And not only the resources of the earth, but the ability of the earth to cope with more and more material growth is obviously at an end if you look at all seriously at it. So isn't this one of the things we have to do? What kind of society do we want? And if the economy does shrink, if we do have, and it's certainly nobody's doing much about climate change at this point.
Well,
is a society where you have more equality and more collective responsibility, would that be able to cope better with the crisis we're facing?
Well, I think it will cope better with the crisis. I think it would improve things. The trouble is, I think what is happening is the pressures of that environmental collapse are going to start coming to bear. They're going to start increasing the inequality, and then they will hit the poorest hardest first in a global sense, but also in a local sense. So, I don't think it's a very good outlook. I mean, I think a lot of it's perfectly.
The government's already said they're not going to look after people that lose their houses due to sea level rise.
Well, no, I mean, I think this is the thing that would be coping with the environmental crisis over the medium term is not something that is going to happen with the current capitalist model. It won't be able to sustain it. Just things as simple as insurance and so forth won't be able to. But I think the wider problem is that we don't have the social resilience to cope with it.
Rosa Luxemburg once said in the 1930s, when she was looking at the rise of fascism at that point, socialism or barbarianism. She wasn't far wrong.
Well, I think that's a kind of a maybe where it will end. I mean, I fail to say. I just don't see how that the kind of worldview of Christopher Luxon somehow can cope with the things that are going to come down the line at New Zealand. And I think, society is to a degree delusional. I think a lot of people are just think that we're living in at the same time as all this is happening, we've got all these problems. We're living in the wealthiest time of human history. But at the same time, that wealth's really poorly distributed, and it's also destroying the foundations that it's built on. So it's a very contradictory thing. And I think if people haven't experienced a war or a real setback like a lot of people did in the past, they just think it goes on forever. And this will never change. Things will just keep on, rolling on as they are. And, of course, they're not, because, as you've mentioned, there's hard limits to the growth and so forth. But I think just on that issue, I'm not necessarily fully convinced about the green argument of degrowth or no growth, because I think there's different types of growth. You can have growth in kind of the way in terms of education or innovation or so forth, in which you can do things better for less, So, I think there's I get a little bit nervous about the idea of kind of going backwards in terms of wealth, because I think what will happen is that will be used by the people in charge to kind of, to say what you need to recycle your plastic bags more while they've still got their private jets, that old chestnut.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that they've managed to do is talk about climate change in purely private. We'll recycle, you drive a electric car, and we don't really need to have society change or corporate change, certainly not socialism, because the individual will take care of it all by recycling or growing a garden or, it's individualized responsibility, not society's responsibility.
Yes, no. Well, that's the way it works for those. It's a great way of.
What was your feeling about the New York City mayoral elections?
Oh well, look, obviously a great result for Zohran Mamdani, and people are very happy about it. I think it's a great sign. I think his policies are excellent. They're very much in line, actually, with really what we see the Alliance as a democratic socialist party that actually has real reform, not just kind of like tweaking. But on the other side of it, I think people have to be realistic that he's just one guy, and obviously he's got a big team behind him. But I think the part of the problem with the left is we have so few victories that we get someone who pops up and has a win, and everyone loses. You know, it's just this is it. We're going to get there, and it's like, well, no. It's a lot more work because you must remember that he's the mayor of New York City, but the President of the United States of America is Donald Trump. So one of them is more important than the other, and it's not our mate Zohran. And so, you know, it's a good sign, but I think people have to get away from just seeing kind of these individual saviours who are going to save the day. No matter how good individual people are, we've got to build a movement, and more than a movement, it's got to be a party. We've got to learn to organise again into unions, into political parties, into community organisations. Organisation and unity is the only way that the majority of working class people can have an influence on their society, because you're not going to have an individual influence on those things unless you've got $10 billion.
Thanks a lot, Victor, for talking about why we need radical socialism and why the average person has to work together to build a party or a group that represents ordinary people and is willing to act on that.
Thank you, Marvin. Always a pleasure.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.